Well, I want to review, I'm going to review every week, but let's review from week 1, and we're still on our introduction. Number 1, Hebrews was written to exhort Christians who were struggling to keep their faith and remain true to Jesus. That is the main emphasis of Hebrews. Christians who were in danger of becoming apostatizing. Also remember that the Old Testament will be frequently referenced in Hebrews. Every chapter in Hebrews will have quotations from the Old Testament or allusions to the Old Testament. And I think that's one thing that scares a lot of people off from studying Hebrews is the Old Testament. Terminology regarding Levitical priestly functions will be frequently encountered. Jesus is going to be our high priest, and we talked about syncresis, this comparison and contrast. So Jesus is going to be later on in Hebrews our high priest compared to the Old Testament high priest, and especially Aaron. That is going to be the main emphasis, is comparison to the tabernacle high priest, not the temple high priest. In fact, the author of Hebrews never mentions the temple. There's going to be a lot of figurative language that will be encountered in Hebrews. Don't let that scare you off. It's not meant to be taken literally. Just understand it when you see it. Well, my remote working? Oh, we'll just use that one. What will be emphasized by the author is our purified conscience through a superior covenant mediated by our high priest, Jesus Christ. And it's also going to be emphasized by the author that Jesus is in heaven and he is constantly interceding for us eternally. That word forever we'll encounter quite a bit. What was the genre of Hebrews we talked about? The letter itself refers to itself as an exhortation, okay, a word of exhortation in chapter 13, verse 22. A lot of people think of the word exhortation in that it's positive, okay? You know, one of the reasons that we come to church is, as was mentioned just a few minutes ago, is the exhortation or edification of one another here at church. However, exhortation can also be negative, all right? Exhortation can convey the idea also of a warning or admonition, you know, which is a criticism, a disapproval of someone doing something. We're going to have the author disapproving of quite a few times of the Christians' faith in Hebrews. The main key word in Hebrews, and I could have picked several key words, is hold. We'll see it in chapter 3, verse 6, 14, chapter 4, 14, chapter 6, 18, and chapter 10, verse 23. Hold to what? And we'll come to that. So we're going to want to understand what the Hebrews author is telling them to hold to. Many possibilities have been floated about in modern times and in times in the past. Who was the author of Hebrews? But as I mentioned, it boils down to this. Either Paul wrote Hebrews or we don't know who wrote Hebrews, okay? That's just it. We talked about hapax legomenoi. These are words that are only used one time in the New Testament, all right? And there are 154 of them in Hebrews. That is unusual, all right? So we'll see words throughout the New Testament that are hapax legomenoi, but in Hebrews there's quite a few of them. So if Paul did not write Hebrews, who did write it? Eusebius, we talked about, which is a church father in the 4th century AD. And I might as well take a moment to talk about AD, okay? What this stands for and why I'm going to use this instead of the common era, okay? Most people in this audience are familiar with the terminology AD or BC, not CE or BCE. AD stands for Anno Domini, I believe, and properly, if you use it, it goes before the date, all right? So it means the year of our Lord, all right? It's Latin. So Anno Domini, that would be Jesus Christ being born, and then you got, first year he's born, second year, so forth. Historically, that's not accurate, all right? Jesus was not born in 1 AD, all right? Jesus was born, we understand, during the reign of Herod the Great. Herod the Great actually died, rather, in 4 to 5 BC, okay? Probably 4 BC. So if Christ was born before the death of Herod, he's actually born 5 or 4 BC, okay? So, however, I understand that most people understand AD and BC better than Common Era, which is what this references to, this dating system. That is what I'm going to use, okay? It's not a big deal, but I want to be plain about why I am using it. So, Eusebius, he's in the 4th century AD. He quotes Origen, who's a well-known church father, who lived from 184 to 253. Origen wrote, who really wrote the epistle? God knows. Now, here's the caveat with that statement. Everywhere else that Origen wrote, he refers to Paul as the author. So, did Origen actually make this statement? I really have my doubts since it's Eusebius who's attaching the quotation to Origen. To me, if God wanted the identity of the author to remain obscure, what makes you think that any scholar can figure it out? All right? And there's been 2 millennia since then. Almost 2 millennia. We can say this about the Hebrews author. The person is likely a male. A masculine participle is used in 1132. When I say masculine participle, I'm referring to the Greek, original Greek. So it's likely a male. The author has a thorough knowledge of the Greek Old Testament. When I say Greek Old Testament here, I am referring to the Septuagint, all right, that was translated in the 3rd century BC. Now, this is really important. Paul's got a thorough knowledge of the Old Testament. However, he doesn't always quote the Septuagint. We really don't know exactly what Paul quoted from his source of the Old Testament, whether it was the Hebrew text or the Aramaic text of the Old Testament, or perhaps he did use the Septuagint. But Hebrews, for the most part, uses the Septuagint translation of the Greek Old Testament. He was 1 generation removed from the apostles. We'll see this in 2:3 where he creates this distance. So he's what we would call a 2nd generation Christian. It is apparent through the writing of Hebrews that he has had a formal education, sort of like Paul. Paul studied under Gamaliel, right? So he's had a formal education, and this included rhetorical and philosophical training, probably. This is not the case with most of the authors of the New Testament. He knew Timothy. As we mentioned last week, Timothy's a pretty easy character in the New Testament. There's only one, all right? So there's no confusion on who this Timothy is that's being discussed. And Timothy is mentioned in the last chapter, verse 23. The question is this, however: how old is Timothy? All right, that's the $64 question, as they say. So we don't know. The author is a person of authority in the church. If you read Hebrews, the tone and contents of the book support that the author wrote as a recognized Christian teacher that was inspired by the Holy Spirit. Why else would he be writing to this audience? It's an audience of Christians that he didn't convert, and we see that in 2:3 that he creates that distance. So if the author was not Paul, I think my opinion is that he was familiar with Paul. Obviously, Paul was a well-known apostolic teacher in the first century. And I think this gentleman that wrote Hebrews was familiar with Paul and perhaps was one of the traveling companions of Paul. Paul will mention 32 names in his known letters. And I say known letters, the epistles that we know that Paul wrote. And I'm sure that there are other people who are not named. He always had a mission team around him. And if that is the case, that this gentleman was a traveling companion of Paul, we could say that he was influenced by Paul. And putting all this together, we could see why people in the first century thought that Paul was the author of Hebrews and why Hebrews is included in the New Testament. If the author was anonymous in antiquity, it is highly doubtful that Hebrews would have made it into the New Testament canon. Regardless of whoever wrote Hebrews, the recipients knew who the author was. All right, we'll see that in chapter 13. They know exactly who is writing to them. So who was this audience of Hebrews? That is, what was the destination of the Hebrews letter? There's been two suggested locations. Well, more than two, but two big ones. The two most suggested locations are Jerusalem, which certainly had the most early Christians, started on the day of Pentecost, and Rome, which had a large Jewish population. Alexandria has also been mentioned and suggested due to a large Jewish population, but most scholars tend to lean toward Rome or Jerusalem. Who are the people being addressed? Good question. Since we discussed that there are references to the Old Testament, or at least allusions to the Old Testament in every chapter, it's more than likely, since there are arguments also against the Levitical priesthood, that Hebrews was written to one of two populations, one being Gentile Christians that were drawn to Judaism. Secondly, Jewish Christians who were in danger of recanting their Christian faith and reverting back to Judaism. So in category one, you actually either have what we would call God-fearers, perhaps, which we're going to discuss, or proselytes that perhaps had converted to Judaism and then become Christians. And then in category two, Jews who had become Christians. However, the big emphasis in Hebrews is that don't go back to the old covenant, the old law, all right? Keep your Christian faith. So it's probably one of these two categories. It's unlikely that this was written to Gentile pagan converts. Pagan converts wouldn't have any clue about the argument of the old covenant, the old law, the Levitical priesthood, and all of the Old Testament references. What would Moses mean to a pagan? Nothing. So, was Hebrews written to Jerusalem? How would one argue that Jerusalem was the destination of the Hebrews letter? As we mentioned, there are a lot of Christians that were in Jerusalem. It's where Christianity started, and the explosion of people converting to Christianity. Hebrews mentions the Old Testament frequently, as we just talked about, and Jewish Christians certainly would be familiar with the Old Testament passages that are being quoted. You've got the temple and the sacrifices that are located in Jerusalem. It is the most common opinion among ancient Christian commentators, and I've included it through. You got Chrysostom, Theodore, Mopsuesta, Jerome, that Hebrews was written to Jerusalem. There's going to be discussion in Hebrews of the Levitical sacrificial system. And this is often taken as reflective of a Judean setting. However, Hebrews was not written to Jerusalem because they had already experienced martyrdom, a person killed for their religious beliefs. And you can look at Acts 12:2, James. This position is supported by Hebrews 12:4 when Hebrews is discussing the persecution of these Hebrew Christians, that states that they had not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood, which is losing your life, martyrdom for the religion. So Hebrews was not written to Jerusalem. Was Hebrews written to Rome? Very common opinion, and I think that's my opinion. Rome had a thriving Jewish community in the 1st century AD. It had the largest Jewish community outside of Jerusalem, with an estimated Jewish population of 20 to 40,000. Rome had an estimated total population of 1 million, and that's not including slaves, and it's estimated there are about 500,000 slaves in Rome in the 1st century AD. It's a metropolis. If Rome was addressed to Rome, we start over that one. If Hebrews was addressed to Rome, and the Romans knew that Paul did not write it, that might explain the reluctance of the Western churches to accept it into the New Testament canon. We talked about that the Eastern churches, the Greek Orthodox churches, their stated opinion is that Paul wrote Hebrews. However, if this letter was written to Rome, or a congregation in Rome, and the people there knew that Paul did not write it, this would explain why this letter possibly was not accepted into the New Testament canon until about the 4th century. So a lot of the Western churches knew possibly that Paul didn't write it. It has been suggested that the phrase former days in 10:32 through 33 could refer to the Roman Emperor Claudius's expulsion of the Jews from Rome that we read about in Acts 18:2, where Priscilla and Aquila had been in this group that had been expelled from Rome. And this event occurred in AD 49. And there are at least 2 Roman historians that will document this, Suetonius and Cassius Dio. Josephus, that Jewish historian, remember he's actually during the Jewish revolt, he didn't commit suicide, was captured by the Romans, and basically devoted his life to writing a history of the Jews, which is called the Antiquities. He wrote, in the 9th year, the Jews were expelled by Claudius from the city. So Claudius, if you go 41 to 49, that's the 9th year of Claudius. So seems to be correct. Others have argued that these former days refer to the persecution under the Roman Emperor Nero in 64 to 68. If Hebrews was written to a Roman congregation, its availability might account for Clement of Rome, quoting Hebrews in a letter he wrote to the church at Corinth in First Clement, which is perhaps one of the earliest Christian writings. And this is approximately AD 96. But Clement quotes many other books of the New Testament. So Hebrews might have just been very well and widely circulated by this time. Also, the phrase in chapter 13, verse 24, those from Italy greet you, does that mean I'm writing from Italy? Or those from Italy are sending greetings back home? Good question. The Hebrews audience definitely lived in an urban area. Only urban areas had prisons. And you can look at Hebrews 10:34 and chapter 13, verse 3 as a reference of prisoners. All right. Why were there prisons in the ancient world? It's an interesting question. People in antiquity are not sentenced to prisons for punishment. People go to prison to await a trial and possible punishment if found guilty. So they're basically held in custody until the judge or ruling official, whatever they're called, could arrive. People are not put into prison after sentencing, as we would say, for punishment. You're waiting there to be tried or punished. So a Roman official is not going to ride out into the middle of nowhere to hear a case. A prison is going to be in an urban setting. And it is interesting to read about these prisons because, people complain about prison reform nowadays in America. These were some very difficult places. Hebrews was written to a Jewish Christian audience. I think that certainly is reflective of the author. The title of the book, To the Hebrews, suggests the audience is ethnically Hebrew, Jewish. However, the word Hebrews, you read all 305 verses, you're not going to read the word Hebrews anywhere in 305 verses. It's not used. So, as we mentioned, the title is probably secondary, that it's an editorial label. It's added by somebody else than the author, all right? If any of us write something, we usually put a title to it, do we not? Somebody had a writing, had no title, so I'm going to add a title. That's what happened. So the assumption that Hebrews was written to Jews is probably correct. As we mentioned, there are Old Testament quotations in nearly every chapter, allusions to the Old Testament. There are 35 quotations of the Old Testament in Hebrews. However, this is not the most in the New Testament. Romans has 63 quotations. Maybe that's another reason Paul might have wrote Hebrews, right? A lot of quotations in Romans, a lot of quotations in Hebrews. Makes you confusing. So the book assumes that the audience has a thorough knowledge of the Old Testament. We're going to see a lot of Old Testament characters, prophets, Moses, Joshua, Aaron, chapter 11, all those names that are mentioned that were faithful. However, one of the big emphasis will be the wilderness generation in discussing apostasy. Hebrews also, as we mentioned, contains an interest in the Levitical sacrificial cult and priesthood. If you were an ethnic Jew that was brought up Jewish, you would be familiar with both the Levitical priestly system and also all of these Old Testament characters that the Hebrews author is going to discuss. If you were a Jewish Christian in this congregation, why would you be tempted to go back to Judaism? That's a really good question. Number one is fear of persecution. It is evident from chapter 12 in Hebrews that there has been persecution of these Hebrew Christians. However, 12:4 states that they had not yet suffered martyrdom. This persecution could have been public humiliation, loss of property, loss of business, or physical torture. People nowadays think they're being persecuted. You know, people on social media think that people are, they say bad things about them. And they think they're truly being persecuted. They don't know what persecution is. And the Hebrews author later on is going to basically say that same statement. None of us have suffered loss of property. None of us have lost a business. None of us have had physical torture to us. So, if this was written during the reign of Nero and to a Roman congregation, certainly persecution was a possibility. However, as we mentioned, this persecution has not been to the severity where they're losing their lives, where blood's been shed. So they've not suffered martyrdom yet. If Hebrews was written during the reign of Nero, who reigned from 54 to 68 AD, it would have to be before 64, because Christians at that time were being martyred during Nero's reign. So if we're going to date this, it would be at least prior to that date. Another reason that if you were a Jewish Christian to revert back to Judaism might be that Judaism was a recognized legal religion. The Latin word religio, again, one of those transliterated words we have in English, religion, religio. Judaism was a recognized religion in the Roman Empire. And if you were a recognized religion, this afforded certain legal protection. Nobody could come take your property. Nobody could come beat you up without a reason. Prior to AD 313, Christianity had no legal status as a religio in the Roman Empire. It was regarded as a superstitio. What word do we get from superstitio? Superstitious, absolutely. It was a term of low respect, and we still think of people being superstitious, sort of mostly low respect. So it had no legal status whatsoever. If you were part of a religion that was similar to Christianity, when I say similar to Christianity, I'm referring to belief in one God, monotheism, it might be tempting not to be persecuted. And I think that's the main reason. We're going to talk later on about apostasy, and there's going to be a lot of argument in the early church on people being persecuted, leaving the church, and then later on coming back to the church when the persecutions died down. All right? That's a real problem in the early church. The Roman Empire, for the most part, was tolerant of other religions as long as they pledged loyalty to the empire. If you read the New Testament, the Romans aren't the ones that are persecuting Christians. It's really the Jews who are. One thing that the Roman population really never understood about Christianity or Judaism was the refusal to worship state gods. It didn't make any sense to them. They had their polytheistic pagan background, so they had many gods, and it didn't make a lot of sense to a lot of Romans that if you were a Christian or whether you were a Jew, that you would worship only one God. They really never understood that. Roman persecution really, until the 4th century, was sporadic. It didn't happen all the time, but it was possible at any time. Persecution during the 3rd century really intensified against Christianity, and Christianity would be outlawed in AD 250 by the Roman Emperor Decius, who believed that religious division angered the gods, okay? And so you need to worship the state gods, is his opinion. So persecution of Christians would continue until the Edict of Milan in 313, which didn't grant it this legal status, okay? But the Edict of Milan was more for religious tolerance. And it wasn't only Christianity, it was other religions also. So Christianity was tolerated. Later on, Constantine would change that. Judaism was an ancient religion. Remember the Greek argument we talked about, that odor is better? We're going to see that throughout Hebrews, that odor is better. We still think that way nowadays, do we not? I mean, the good old days. I mean, how many people here, if I was to ask a show of hands, think that the 1950s were better than the 2020s in America? Or even the 60s, 70s? Yeah, we still think this that way nowadays, the good old days. It's somewhat natural, I think, that something older is better. I mean, when people go antique shopping, they're not looking for something 15 years old, are they? They want something 115 years old, all right? So older is better. Most of the early Christians had connections with the synagogues, whether they were former Jews or what we would call God-fearers. And we'll discuss them in a moment. If you were a Jew that became a Christian, there had to be a significant amount of ostracism from the Jewish community. And by that, I mean if you converted to Christianity and you were a Jew, nobody's going to have nothing to do with you. All right? You were an outcast. All right? So coming back home certainly would have been more comfortably socially for a lot of Jewish Christians. Another argument would be that Jesus was Jewish. How better to imitate Jesus than to be Jewish? All right? Perhaps these Christian Jews were hearing allegations that Jesus was not the real Messiah. The real Messiah was yet to come. Is that not a belief that Jews hold today, that the Messiah's not came yet? So that certainly could have been a teaching. There are certainly examples throughout the New Testament of Judaizing teachers that are trying to influence Jewish Christians to revert back to Jewish customs and laws. Whatever the reason, the recipients of this book were being tempted to abandon Christianity and revert back to Judaism. That you need to remember. Hebrews was written to show Christ's supremacy over Judaism. I mentioned the word God-fearers, so let's talk about God-fearers in the synagogues, which certainly may be a population of this Hebrew congregation. The Jewish synagogue in the diaspora, when I mention diaspora, I mean the dispersion of the Jews outside of Judea, outside of Palestine, attracted non-Jews as well as ethnic Jews. Okay, so it would be like us having a visitor that came here. All right, there were visitors that came to the synagogues. These God-fearers could attend worship, didn't necessarily participate in it, but obviously they became familiar with the Old Testament scriptures that were being taught at the synagogues. These God-fearers were attracted by this monotheism, this belief in one God, as we mentioned, and having an ethical religion. All right? Judaism is an ethical religion. Christianity is an ethical religion. If you look at the Greco-Roman polytheistic religion, it does not preach morality. All right? This was an attraction to people, this morality aspect of this Judaism. And this may have been a contributing reason as to why the gospel was proclaimed in the first century. Having a universal Greek language to communicate with and a Roman road system or ships was also paramount in spreading the gospel. Some of these Gentiles converted to Judaism. We would call them proselytes. That's what the term proselyte means, that they convert to Judaism. So they would be circumcised, right? It would appear from the scriptures that the Jewish synagogues weren't really insistent on these, quote, God-fearers, that they were called, converting to Judaism. They were just happy they were there, come to the synagogue, listen to what we got to say and give us your money. So they weren't insistent upon Gentiles converting to Judaism. The term God-fearers is frequently found in the Jewish diaspora literature, including many synagogue inscriptions that have survived. So this audience certainly may have been included in the recipients of the book of Hebrews. When was Hebrews written? Here's the bottom line. It's impossible to pinpoint the exact date when Hebrews was written. If you look at the accepted range by most scholars, it's somewhere between 60 to 96 AD. We know that Clement of Rome, when he wrote First Clement in 96 AD, quoted Hebrews. So it's at least available before 96 AD. That is definite. However, inside this time range, the most important argument is this. Was Hebrews written before AD 70 or after AD 70? And why AD 70? That is the date of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the future emperor Titus. His father was Vespasian, who became emperor, and Titus would succeed him. So that is why the 70 date, most people argue pre-70 or post-70, all right? Most conservative scholars take a pre-70 date. Most liberal scholars will take a post-70 AD date. So how could we give evidence for a pre-70 AD date of Hebrews? If you look at Hebrews 7:8, the phrase, here mortal men receive tithes, all right? And it's referring to the Levites. So that's perhaps a hint that the letter was written before AD 70, if tithes are still being received by the Levites, all right? Reference to Levitical rituals are used in present tense, all right? That means they're ongoing, something in present tense. So the temple is still standing. So you could document Hebrews 7, 27 through 28, Hebrews 8, 3 through 5, chapter 9, 7 through 8, 10, 1 through 3, 13, 10, etc. There are many references to the Levitical rituals that are used in present tense. So the author writes as if these rituals are still occurring. So this would, to me, support a pre-70 date, and I agree with that. That's my opinion. Hebrews lacks any reference to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, as we mentioned. Don't you think that if the temple was destroyed, that would have been what we call a powerful apologetic argument against Judaism? Okay, it's gone. Why are you still believing in it? However, the Hebrews author never talks about the temple or the contemporary temple practice. He may refer to the tabernacle and the priestly practices then, but never contemporary priestly rituals. As I mentioned, the word temple is never used in Hebrews. He also references that he's a contemporary with Timothy, all right, in chapter 13, verse 23. And this, to me, is also suggestive of an earlier date in the apostolic period. However, the question we mentioned is, how old is Timothy? Good question. So how could we argue that Hebrews is post-70 AD? Perhaps the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in AD 70 is not as catastrophic to the Jews as we assume it to be. If you were a Pharisee, you really didn't utilize the temple at all, if any. Well, I should say at all, but very little, if at all. The Pharisees had been disenfranchised with the temple long before its destruction, and that's evident from the scriptures. The synagogue was their center of worship. If you look at the high priesthood, it had long been controlled by the Sadducaic sect of the Jews. In fact, if you look at the New Testament scriptures, the high priest are Sadducees, all right, that are mentioned. So the Pharisees, they'd lost control of the high priesthood a long time ago. However, understand during this Hellenistic and Roman time period, you had no clue on whether the high priest in charge was qualified or not. What was the biggest thing for qualification? It was genealogy, correct? Being a descendant of Aaron. Most high priests during the Hellenistic or Roman time period bribed their way to power. So it didn't have anything to do with genealogy. It was money. The Pharisees would later on morph into what we know as Rabbinic Judaism. The temple really didn't matter to most Jews outside of Palestine. You can go to synagogues all throughout Europe, Middle East, and most Jews certainly didn't make this required 3 trips to the temple every year. So worship in the diaspora was centered in the synagogues. And since we mentioned, Clement of Rome, he's quoting Hebrews in his writing to the Corinth church, you would think that if this was written later on after AD 70, and certainly Clement is alive during this time, he would know who the author was. Makes sense to me. So if this was written at a later date and I'm quoting it in my writing, wouldn't I know who wrote it? However, wouldn't I know that it was also to a congregation possibly in Rome? However, Clement, in all of his writings, he doesn't mention who the author is, nor the destination. So it's my opinion personally, and this is, again, opinion, that since Clement is quoting Hebrews as inspired scripture, it's been circulating around a while. However, this is not conclusive evidence one way or the other when Hebrews was written. The audience, as we mentioned, are second generation Christians, in chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. If this date is accepted, this would definitely rule out Jerusalem as the destination of the letter, since the temple's destroyed in 70 AD. Well, this probably is a good place for us to stop, since I have no further time. We will finish the introduction next week and start chapter 1. Thank you.